Welcome, Old World Explorers. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the old high schools of America. Small town, big city. Let's roll through some of the slides I have here for you. You'll see here as well, I've added an estimated population for 1900. Many of these supposedly having been built in and around that time, before and after. So I just thought I would add that in as we stroll through this. And of course, if you're familiar with the channel, we view a lot of history through the lens of an intentional distortion, misdirection, and believe what we're looking at is evidence of a past that we are not familiar with, and probability of these buildings having been built in the manner we are told at the time we are told, with the means we are told, doesn't pass the smell test. And as you look further into this research, you'll find that to be the case more and more. You have to ask the question, why would a city like Galveston, Texas here build a high school in such a manner? Here we have a population estimate, not a large community. At the time, these buildings going up all over the place, so often you get the rebuttal that they would ship in these master craftspeople to build these structures. But these are getting done, supposedly, according to our narrative, getting built all around, in and around the same time. Very difficult to make that assertion, I think, once you realize how much development was going on, as far as we were told. And of course, if you compare these types of structures to what is built in the modern day, let's check a modern day high school. And this is just a quick search, modern high school building, and a DuckDuckGo search. And right away, the visual presence of what we're looking at changes. Hard 90 degrees, boxes, slightly sloped roofs, no ornamentation whatsoever. Okay, so there's a contradiction for you, a contrast for you. And of course you have these that look like what we would, to our eye, look like castles. Something more like a Hogwarts, if you're familiar with the Harry Potter series. And keep in mind here that, like I said, most of these would have to have been erect by 1900, and not making sense as well, according to the population of these towns. As far as the need, when you picture early school buildings, you don't picture this type of majesty. I'd also like to point out too, something about the old world visual structures is tied in with the horror genre of pop culture. I'll just illustrate that now with a search. And this is just a search I did called Classic Haunted House. And these are the images we're given for what we consider in our pop culture these days to be a classic haunted house. So isn't that interesting that we are getting this old world style of building portrayed to us as some relic, some haunted relic of the past, to be fearful of? I find that an interesting part of pop culture, because as we get into this video, we realize high school really is the place where pop culture is formed, and pop culture is given the grounds to shape society. That's what I believe a lot of these became, indoctrination centers. I'll play for you now a short video brought to you by fantastic researcher James Corbett. I'll just play the audio as I go through the visuals. This is him talking about the beginnings of the funding of the education system and the monopolizing of the education system with some of the usual suspects. So let's just give this a listen as we scroll through.
Rockefeller made sure to get the better end of the bargain. He would donate his great wealth to the creation of public institutions, but those institutions would be used to bend society to his will. As every would-be ruler throughout history has realized, society has to be transformed from the ground up. Americans in the 19th century still prized education and intellectual pursuits, with the 1840 census finding unsurprisingly that the United States, a nation that had been mobilized by tracts like Thomas Paine's remarkably popular Common Sense, was a nation of readers with a remarkable 93% to 100% literacy rate. Before the first compulsory schooling laws in Massachusetts in 1852, education was private and decentralized, and as a result classical education, including study of Greek and Latin and a solid grounding in history and science, was widespread. But a nation of individuals who could think for themselves was anathema to the monopolists. The oligarchs needed a mass of obedient workers, an entire class of people whose intellect was developed just enough to prepare them for lives of drudgery in a factory. Into the midst stepped John D. Rockefeller with his first great act of public charity, the establishment of the University of Chicago. He was aided in this task by Frederick Taylor Gates, a Baptist minister that Rockefeller befriended in 1889 and who would go on to be John D.'s most trusted philanthropic advisor. Gates would go on to write a short tract, The Country School of Tomorrow, that laid out the Rockefeller plan for education. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and, unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers, or men of learning or science. We are not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. Although Rockefeller's resources weren't exactly limitless, they might as well have been. In 1902, he established the General Education Board to help implement Gates's vision for the country school of tomorrow with a staggering $180 million endowment. The Rockefeller influence on education was felt almost immediately, and it was amplified by help from fellow monopolists of the era who were approaching the topic of philanthropy from the same angle. Although best known as a steel magnate, Andrew Carnegie's fortune started on the railroads transporting Rockefeller's Standard Oil around the country, and was greatly magnified by a lucrative investment in property near Oil Creek that provided steady, profitable oil sales. In 1905, he established the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, a tax-free foundation through which Carnegie and his appointees could direct the development of the education system in the United States and, eventually, worldwide. In 1910, Rockefeller followed suit by establishing the Rockefeller Foundation, which became the tax-free umbrella organization for his philanthropic ambitions. As the Reese Committee, a congressional investigation into the activities of these tax-free foundations in the 1950s, discovered, it wasn't long before Carnegie's endowment approached Rockefeller's foundation with a proposal to cooperate on their shared desire to transform the American education system in their own image. Norman Dodd, the director of research for the congressional committee who was granted access to the Carnegie Endowment's board minutes, explains.
So they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in an alteration of the teaching of American history. So they approach four of the then most prominent teachers of American history in the country, people like Charles and Mary Bird, and their suggestion to them is, will they alter the manner in which they present this subject, and they get turned down flat. So they then decide that it is necessary for them to do, as they say, build our own stable of historians. And then they approach the Guggenheim Foundation, which specializes in fellowships, and say, when we find young men in the process of studying for doctorates in the field of American history, and we feel that they are the right caliber. Will you grant them fellowships on our say-so? And the answer is yes. So under that condition, eventually they assemble 20. And they take this 20 potential teachers of American history to London, and there they're briefed into what is expected of them when, as and if they secure appointments in keeping with the doctorates they will have earned. And that group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association. And then toward the end of the 1920s, the endowment grants to the American Historical Association $400,000 for a study of our history in a manner which points to what can this country can it look forward to in the future. And that culminates in a 7-volume study, the last volume of which is, of course, in essence a summary of the contents of the other 6. And the essence of the last volume is the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency.
An interesting assessment, Corbett's research. I'll sort of veer away from where he sort of gets into these wealthy philanthropists trying to secure their wealth as the motivation, although he does go a lot deeper into that their aims in that regard. But I'll suggest that what we're looking at is a complete renovation of an education system, an overhaul of what's being taught, and a wiping the slate clean, as you heard in that video. So the usual suspects involved with teaching the new curriculum, forcing the new curriculum, rewarding the teachers of the new curriculum, and then if you can envision the timeline of this occurring pre-World War II, World War II being the I would say a great reset, a finalization of a great reset, and then a resetting with the new narrative and the introduction of Hollywood on a mass scale, introduction of the television set, the TV dinner, and all the rest of it, and of course goes hand in hand with the new history being taught in these education centers. Of course, many of these also being torn down in that time period after World War II, the erasing of the visual evidence, the distorting of the visual evidence of the old world, and voila, here we are today. That's kind of how I see it. That's sort of how it takes shape in my mind. We're looking at a lot of buildings that predate that the enormous funding that we saw those robber barons involved with. These were already standing structures before they pumped their millions into it, as far as we're told. Of course, take it all with a grain, according to the narrative. So I think we're looking at structures that survived some sort of cataclysm, mud flood, if you want to call it that, and then we have the renovation of history and the physical renovation of a lot of these buildings, and the implementation of the education system. Also very intimidating feeling buildings. So as a young individual, a teenager, attending a building such as this would have a very, almost a religious feel. The energy would be overwhelming. The, how do I put this? The solidification of the authority of what you're being taught would be immense when you have structures like this. It's basically saying These are all a product of this education that I'm learning now. And so really getting people to buy into the system with the majesty of this old world architecture, the intimidation of the majesty of the old world architecture. And like as you're seeing, as we're scrolling along, we're getting close to the end of the file here. There really is no shortage. I could have easily doubled the size of this file, just in the States alone. Canada as well has got a lot of similarities. You're seeing the same things repeat themselves. You're seeing the stone arches, the towers, low population numbers, massive structures, difficult builds. Logistics, of course, don't add up. The logistics to build these, and of course the historical information on many of these buildings is not there. It's sparse, it's vague, it's contradictory, and it's obvious. So, high school. We've all been there, and we've all experienced it, and I think another part of this program we've been run through has to do with a prolonged adolescence, that they try to keep us in a state of prolonged adolescence. The cool kids and popular kids, and, they want us to carry that through life, and they use Hollywood to maintain that prolonged adolescence, I think. Keep you in a state of chasing, always uncomfortable in your own skin, always wanting more. I think that's part of their narrative. I suggest, good people, be comfortable in your own skin, be happy in your own skin. Okay, you're good enough. Of course, we can always do better, but that negativity has been implanted into our culture, into our minds, as part of the mechanism control. So shake it off. I hope you have a wonderful 2023, and I thank you for watching.